I'm Erin Peachy. I work on the system planning team. The focus of our group is to provide planning, resource planning, and transmission and distribution planning support for the company. Our most recent focus being the transition to a decarbonized grid and on our path to 2030 to meet our renewable energy targets and the phase out of coal. So I'm going to spend some time today just walking through what our team does and specifically focus on the Evergreen IRP, which is our integrated resource plan that is sort of underpinning and translating the path to 2030. Okay. So before we jump into what the integrated resource plan looks like and our path to 2030, it's first really important to understand what is the IRP. So what is this? What is the process that we undertake, and what are the objectives associated with it? So the IRP is a comprehensive planning exercise that evaluates sort of our supply and demand resource options against a series of input assumptions, most notably our load forecast, which is heavily influenced by the electrification that's happening in Nova Scotia, as well as fuel prices, all of our environmental policy initiatives in 2030 and beyond, as well as capital costs. And the intent of this is really to develop a directional long-term electricity strategy for Nova Scotia Power that is able to withstand a wide range of foreseeable outcomes in the planning environment. So what are the objectives of the Nova Scotia IRP? So first, it's develop a robust, risk-weighted, least-cost long-term electricity strategy that ensures that we have the ability, as we're decarbonizing the grid, to deliver energy in a safe and reliable manner. The second piece is to develop an action plan and roadmap items. So the action plan is essentially our key strategic actions that we're taking on the path to achieve our 2030 targets, whereas the roadmap items are the stage gates or the monitoring components of our plan that allow us to observe any significant changes that occur in the planning environment that might trigger a change to our action plan or trigger additional assessment to understand if any changes are required. And then finally, a key objective of our Nova Scotia Power IRP is to develop a collaborative, transparent, and evergreen electric utility resource planning process. And so what we mean by that is that we want to stay live to any changes that are occurring in the planning system. We also want to make sure that we're being open and engaging with stakeholders as we proceed through the IRP planning process to ensure that we're reflecting industry best practices and staying live to any significant changes that are occurring. Okay, so to give you a sense of how we got here, in 2020, November of 2020 specifically, we completed a comprehensive IRP. And so that looked at a wide range of studies to inform our integrated resource plan based on our understanding of the planning environment at the time. As part of the outcome of that IRP, we indicated the need for an evergreening process, which means that as the planning environment changes and we identify significant changes in that planning environment, we are committed to doing an updated assessment to understand if any changes to our action plan and our plan forward are required. So as everyone knows, since we've done the 2020 IRP, there have been significant changes, most notably on the environmental policy side with our 2030 targets and beyond. So we began our first Evergreen IRP last year, and we completed the Nova Scotia Power portion of that analysis in August of this year. So similar to the 2020 IRP, this is a very iterative and stakeholder-focused process. So as you can see by our plan here, at each of the different stage gates, when we're developing the scope and assumptions, when we're reviewing our draft and final modeling results, and when we're also reviewing our action plan and roadmap that underpins the plan forward, we're engaging with stakeholders to receive their feedback and include that in our analysis. So to give you more detailed understanding of what that looks like, this just gives you a sense of the level of engagement that we have with our stakeholders and who that encompasses as part of that process. So what we want to make sure that we're doing is that all of our engagement with stakeholders is very focused and collaborative and constructive. So we ensure that we have many opportunities available for stakeholders to ensure that they can have access to our materials and provide feedback on those materials. So the first thing that we do is we provide all of our materials on the irp.nspower.ca. If you want some light reading, I would totally recommend visiting the website. We also hold workshop sessions throughout the entire process to review that material and have provide an opportunity for stakeholders to ask informed questions based on the material that we've provided. We also for written comment solicitations, so providing an opportunity for stakeholders to provide written feedback, which we have then responded to in detail. And then we also provided the opportunity for some folks for one-on-one engagements if there's specific issues as part of the IRP that are need to be discussed further. So just to give you a sense of the participants and the stakeholders that have been included in this process, so the Nova Scotia URB staff and consultants, so specifically Bates White and Synapse, the consumer advocate and the small business advocate and their respective consultants. We also work with the province, so specifically NRR and NSE. Of course, Efficiency One and Eastward Energy are very active stakeholders in the process. Ecology Action Centre and Dalhousie University are active as well. And then, of course, we have a significant interest, of course, in all of the renewable, the area of renewable generation, so CanREA, Energy Storage Canada, Marine Renewables, and Solar Nova Scotia. And then, as well as you can imagine, there's quite a bit of interest from our large load customers, as well as the developers in the area that are supporting wind generation. So just to give you a sense, we have, pretty reasonable activity on our website. Folks are pretty interested. We have good representation from participants and organizations, and we've pretty actively responded to stakeholder feedback as we've gone through the process. So before we can get into understanding what underpins or what the outcomes are of the Evergreen IRP, it's really important to understand what are the key input assumptions or the key driving forces that underpin those outcomes of the IRP. So there is a wide variety of assumptions that went into the Evergreen IRP work, but there are two key planning assumptions that are very important. The first of which is our load profile. So as you know, Nova Scotia Power is planning for a growing electricity system load, which is consistent with what we're seeing in other jurisdictions as part of the transition towards electrifying both our heating and our transportation. So our specific Nova Scotia Power load forecasting process includes those electrification effects of economy-wide transition to net zero. And this comes with a lot of support from E3, which is our expert consultant. And that looks at what are the impacts of building electrification over time, as well as the transition to EV charging within the province. So if I can point to the two graphs that are on the bottom, so the one that's on the left represents our net system requirement, so that's the forecasted amount of energy on an annual basis that we will need to meet the required load, and this is projected out to 2040. The one on the bottom, on the right, is our firm peak forecast. So that's essentially the max amount of load that we're going to have to meet on an annual basis over time, projected out to 2040. So what I want to point out here is that what you're seeing is the dotted lines reflect what our forecasted electrification and load forecast as a result would look like as part of the 2020 IRP. And that's a mix, that's representing a mix of both electrification profiles as well as the benefit of demand-side management or energy efficiency over time. The next line, which is represented by the dotted purple line, reflects what our assumptions were for the Evergreen IRP. So this is now looking at our updated understanding using the great information that we had from E3 as to what the impacts are on our load forecast for indicated by EV charging over time, as well as the electrification of heating. And then from 2030 and beyond, sort of a high electrification profile that reflects that as well. And then what you're seeing in the solid blue line is our 2023 load forecast. So this is telling us a few different things. Number one, it's showing that there's significant value in programs that support DSM or energy efficiency, demand response, and managed EV charging to mitigate what would otherwise be an even higher load requirement on our system. The second piece that's really important is that this shows the need for a robust Evergreen IRP analysis. So what I mean by that is We have modeled about 24 different scenarios, all of which incorporate a range of these forecasted outcomes for load. And so any of the common elements that come out of that analysis then inform our go-forward plan, which means that we should be able to be resilient to any changes that we see in the planning environment going forward based on our action plan.
Can I just ask a clarifying question about
Yep.
the graphs? So the small dots, green, light blue, and orange, those were generated in 2020 during the IRP?
They
and
were.
The ones that would be updated,
Yeah.
more recent?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So those represent what we would have modeled as part of the 2020 IRP. Dash line is the 2022 Evergreen IRP process, and then the 2023 is what we've learned now based on our projected forecasts from the 2023 load forecast. Okay, so the next key driver is associated with our environmental policy requirements. So I'm sure this is no surprise to everyone, the number of environmental policy requirements that would be included in our modeling work. So just to give you a sense of sort of what's included and what's really driving us towards 2030, we of course have our air emissions regulations, which looks at caps on our emitting emissions for mercury, sulfur dioxide, and NOx. We also have our 40% renewable energy standard, which indicates that we have to meet, of the generation, 40% of that has to come from renewable energy sources. Then layered onto that is the Nova Scotia GHG output-based pricing system, or what we call the NSOBPS, which basically says that any emissions above a certain performance standard, depending on the type of fuel you're using, is subject to carbon price, which then leads us to the next piece, which is our federal carbon price trajectory, which between 2023 to 2030 sets the price for carbon that we would have to pay on those emissions above those performance targets. And for the purposes of our modeling, we escalated those prices by 2% annually from 2031 to 2050. And then when we approach 2030, we're now seeing that 80% RES requirement, as well as our coal phase out, which we're planning our system for. And then on top of that is the clean electricity regulations, which I'm sure most folks have been, are maybe more familiar now coming from the federal government. We are currently in the process of engaging with the federal government on what that's going to look like, but we did incorporate some measure of consideration for that in our modeling to reflect performance targets across the system, as well as carbon tax on all emissions above zero. So it's just really to give a sense of sort of the environmental policy impacts on our plan and how this is informing our path to 2030. Okay, so now that we have a good sense of the context for, what is included in the modeling and what's sort of driving the path forward, then it's helpful to understand, okay, what are the outcomes of that modeling? So there, as I mentioned, we modeled about 24 scenarios that looked at a wide range of key drivers, as well as some sensitivities that were meant to reflect potential changes to the system planning environment. So those included a look at net zero targets of either 2035 or 2050, different electrification profiles related to the electrification of heating, as well as whether or not we had the Atlantic Loop, and then a number of different sensitivities layered onto that. What we did as part of our action plan was to look at all of those 24 scenarios and come up with what are the common elements that you can pull out from all of the outcomes from those scenarios to inform our path forward. And so what we found is that there was a need for regular, structured, renewable generation additions, and this is to achieve the solar and the wind build-out that's intended to meet our RES targets, as well as to meet our load requirements on the system. Near-term investments in energy storage and transmission, most notably the reliability tie, which is the second 345 kV AC line going from Nova Scotia to New Brunswick. And this is to ensure that we have a reliable system, as well as to support the integration of variable renewable generation in the form of wind and solar. Also the additions of firm capacity resources. So this would be using a mix of fuel types, including oil and gas, while also allowing for the enabling of burning hydrogen in the future as that technology develops. Another piece that's really important there too is the value of demand response. So that's the value of demand response programming to then decrease the peak load requirements on the system, which then decreases the firm capacity resource additions that are required on the system. And something that's really important to note here is that those resources that are being added to the system that burn both gas and oil are now being operated differently than they would have been in the past. So they're being used as peaking capacity units, meaning they're operating at lower capacity factors in order to help support us on days where demand is at its peak or when our wind generation is quite low. So it helps us to integrate those assets. And then finally, it pointed to fuel conversions at existing Nova Scotia Power sites. So that would be switching to burning oil at some of our sites that are already enabled to do that, and then also converting some of our units to burn natural gas. And so this transformation that I've noted is all enabled by a 2030 resource development plan, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail, and really is based on the outcome of the IRP analysis. And I mean, when you look at this, it's a pretty significant undertaking for us to achieve 2030. So the scope of that transformation is going to require a pretty rapid pace of development from development to commissioning in order to meet our goals and, of course, to maintain system reliability and to be able to meet customer demand. All right, so what does all of that look like when you all of a sudden reach 2030? So I wanted to point to two things. So on the left, you're looking at sort of the distribution of the annual energy when you reach 2030. So this is looking at the percentage of contribution from the different resources in that year. And then the bar graph on the right looks at the new installed capacity to achieve that. So on the left, what you can see is that we're looking at a significant amount, almost 50% of contribution to energy resources in that year from wind. We're also, which compared to our 2022 actuals, was around, I would say 15%. So that's a significant increase and means a significant change to how we're operating our system and meeting our demand. We're also seeing contributions from our existing renewables. We're also seeing contributions from our imports from the Maritime Link, which are very helpful, and then, of course, other renewables, which includes biomass. And so all of that helps us to achieve over 80% RES by 2030. That last little wedge in gray is our natural gas, oil, and future potential for hydrogen burning. And so that wedge is intended to ensure that, like I said, we can meet our peak demand on those peak load days, as well as helping us to integrate wind on the system on those days when wind is low or when the sun isn't shining, when we can't generate from solar. So in order to achieve this, there's a number of different things that really help us on the resource capacity side. So first, there's a number of great initiatives around programming that help us to reduce the peak load on the system before we even have to add our resources, and that's DSM, or energy efficiency, our managed EV charging, and as well our demand response program. So we're projecting, with a lot of support from E1, our value of about 200 megawatts of resources by 2030, just as a result of the DSM programming that's being led by them. In the next chunk is represented by 85 megawatts, and that's looking at the value of managed EV charging over time. So not only time of use rates, meaning that shifting that charging into areas where we're into our non-peak, so that we're reducing the peak load on the system, but also having the ability to have bidirectional charging at a certain point so that we can optimize the amount of charging that we're providing to customers, but then also utilizing that on the grid when it's needed. And then the last piece is our demand response program. So this is about 75 megawatts of value by 2030. And what that is supported by is programming that looks at, again, time of use rates, so shifting customers to utilizing power in times when we're outside of the peak hours, as well as looking at, energy efficiency associated with hot water controllers, and other pilot programs that, once they're validated, can serve to support that 75 megawatts of peak load savings on the system. And then following that, we're going to see new batteries on the system in order to make use or store what would otherwise be curtailed variable renewable generation that can be used to support load requirements at other times. We're also going to add, of course, a significant amount of wind, about 1,500 megawatts, which is pretty that's more than, I think that's going to end up, we're going to end up having, that's a tripling of the amount of wind that we have on the system currently. So that's going to be a significant change, as well as solar additions, in order to meet our RES requirements and make sure that we have enough resources on the system to meet our load requirements. And then, of course, at the bottom, we're going to be seeing new gas additions. So that's new combustion turbines that are natural gas fueled, of about 650 megawatts, operated as peakers, so operating at low capacity factors, as well as the transition from some of our existing resources. So burning oil, as well as converting one of our units to natural gas, all of which to support the integration of the other resources that are added on the system to meet our load requirements as we're decarbonizing our system. So then what does this all look like in terms of a resource development plan? So of course, as I mentioned at the top, this is really going to take sort of a concerted and a very fast-paced effort to get ourselves to 2030. And we're looking at the addition of all of those key components that we talked about, in addition to some integration assets on the system to maintain reliability with a significant increase in wind generation. So what you're seeing here is first wind and solar. Of course, all of the programming that's coming out of, or the procurement programs that are coming out of the province, are going to help to establish the development of wind on our system going forward. We're also going to see our fuel conversions, the addition of fast-acting generation, battery storage, of course, the development and the build of our reliability tie, and then other integration assets to make sure that we have stability on the grid as we're phasing out our coal and losing some of those benefits from coal generation in terms of maintaining reliability on the grid. So what you can see is sort of our build out from our engagement, the application to the board, of course, for approval, the build, and then commissioning. Okay, so what's underpinning all of this, of course, is the updated IRP action plan. So this would be essentially our key pillars of the short-term actionable items that we can take to enable that path to 2030. So, of course, we've got our regional integration strategy that looks at any access to additional imports in other regions and the reliability tie. Electrification, which looks at, okay, what programming, what do the trends look like going forward, and what programming can we put in place, and what T&D infrastructure do we need in place to enable this? Then we're looking at our thermal retirement plan, which is essentially how are we phasing out coal and what are we doing to replace all of that, which includes our wind and solar procurements, battery integration assets, and our conversions. And then finally, the demand response strategy, which supports all of the work to reduce the load on the system in the first place, to reduce the other requirements on the system. So I will stop there and see if there are any questions.
Any questions for Erin?
Okay. No, that's good.
So, super interesting. So,
yeah, really interesting to see this, and I think there's probably been a lot of curiosity from folks in this industry, so it's nice to see some figures. I'm wondering, with the revised, we see that big jump in the especially megawatts required. Did that planning account for the population growth targets that the province has set in terms of number of housing units and yes?
Yeah. So if I can go back to our projections there. So specifically, if you're looking at the dotted purple line, or sorry, the dashed purple line, that would be our assumptions that we included in our 2022 in the Evergreen process. But it was based on partially for the first tranche of it up till 2032 on our 2022 load forecast. So that would have included any sort of projections around load growth due to residential growth or population growth in the province at the time. And then beyond that, it was sort of based on a lot of work that we did with E3. Now, the 2023 load forecast would have sort of those updated metrics around population growth and incorporating that into the forecast. So although that doesn't form the base of our valuation for the Evergreen IRP, it was included as a sensitivity. Meaning that of all of the scenarios that we modeled, that forecast for 2023 was included. And so given that our IRP action plan incorporates or takes all of the common elements from across all scenarios, we feel that the plan going forward has buffered us to handle that increased growth in case we do see that. Yeah.
Okay, I have a follow-up question.
Okay,
Well, somewhat
yeah.
related. Again, looking at that projection, especially out towards, I think it's 2040 at the end there.
Yes.
Does the model account for the change in, like climate, so temperatures, especially cooling loads
Yeah.
in buildings? So yes?
Yes, so it takes that into account actually more in 2023. So our 2022 forecast would have incorporated some of our previous assumptions around what our cold weather targets would be. 2023 has updated versions of that. So it does incorporate more of a load growth associated with colder temperatures.
Oh,
Yeah.
I more meant like in the summer, there's more cooling
Oh, I'm
equipment
sorry.
running.
Yeah, okay.
And
Yeah,
the reason I'm
yeah.
asking is, you showed the chart of
Yeah.
the installed capacity and the mix of installed capacity, and
Yeah.
then the estimated or modeled annual energy mix. So if we have scenarios, especially in the summertime, where there is more electricity demand for cooling,
Yep.
and if wind turbines are not running and therefore the renewable source is not available, the backup, that what you call the fixed something, sources become used more, which then brings down that mix that's presented here. So I'm just kind of trying to tie those together of that 83% that you presented of 83% expected renewable on an annual basis. How much deviation could there be there as we have those type of scenarios coming up?
Yeah, we're actually a winter peaking system, so all of our system is designed towards we're seeing the highest peaks in the winter in those colder periods. So it would be in the evening, after 9 o'clock or something like that. But that's where we're seeing those colder temperatures, and that's actually when we're seeing our system peak and what our system is designed to. So what you're seeing on that chart, which looks at sort of the resource capacity in order to meet our load in 2030, takes that into consideration. So the summer heating piece wouldn't create as much of an influence, but in terms of the capacity that we have to add on the system. But in terms of, we will be using, our emitting generation on those low wind days, however, to make up to help incorporate wind and to meet our system demand. However, all of that variance in terms of the variability increase pump over the summer is all incorporated into that. Yeah, yeah.
Hi, Erin.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
So, quick question. We all want to be, 80 and 500% renewable.
Yeah.
The problem with our grid is the inertia.
Yep.
In all presentations and all those discussions, I never ever read about that. So, are you planning to put synchronous condensers or
Yes.
something like that?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So there's, so actually, thanks for raising that. When we talk about integration assets, that is one of the components that we're talking about is installing synchronous condensers on the system to help replace that inertia to support system strength. We do see some benefits on the frequency side from the reliability tie and even some of the newer technology for the wind generators, but yeah, that's going to be a key one, and it's going to be an outcome of our studies is going to understand how strategically we install those integration assets to make sure that we have a sufficient system strength when we phase out coal. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Thanks. That's good.
Hi, I just have a question regarding the 75 megawatts of demand response.
Yep.
I think you mentioned that there would be time of use rates or like behavioral demand response.
Yes.
But also like the automatic demand response. You mentioned water heaters. I was wondering what other types of loads you plan to control and kind of like what the split you think will be between the time of use rates and the automatic.
Yeah, I would say Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say, so the other piece, so there's the time of use rates, there's the water controllers that support a reduction in our peak load by shifting our usage into the off-peak periods. There's also the programs that we're doing on the commercial and industrial side, and so it's looking at these bigger buildings that have sort of like energy management systems built into their to how their buildings function, and so utilizing those systems to optimize when they're lighting certain parts of the building or heating certain parts of the building to shift them out into the peak, the off-peak periods. I would say that we're still in the pilot phase, so the contribution of each is still being evaluated, but I think we're getting closer and closer to those answers. We've had a couple of really good seasons on both the commercial and industrial side as well as the water heater, and we're actually going to be reporting on that as part of our Evergreen IRP action plan update. So not to give another plug to our process, but on an annual basis, we do provide updates on all those action plan items, and that will be one of them. So we'll have a better sense at that time and be able to share that. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I also want to put in a plug that I work for the Building Decarbonization Alliance, and we have been developing a building decarbonization model that is going to be free and open source, and you'll be able to input various different policy options, like for example, ban on all like oil heating in new construction by this year, or ban on oil heating in this year, and it will output 8760 load profiles for residential and commercial, and so they can be like added to your system planning models if you want to consult them, or if anyone wants to, because it will be free. It's what my team is working on now. So just kind of wanted to put that out there to watch for that coming like the end of this year and early next year.
That's great. And just for clarity too, when we incorporate sort of the DSM, the managed EV charging, as well as the demand response programs, that gets embedded actually in our load forecast. So so these profiles that end up being a significant input into our IRP process already have that incorporated into it. So every year we put out our load forecast, and I think it gets released maybe in March or April. So that's actually great timing for understanding the value of that and how that can influence the load forecast. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Any more questions?
Just wondering if you can go back 2 slides,
Sure.
and you have the, no, maybe the one, it was basically just around the hydrogen-enabled new gas.
Oh, yes.
Is that, it's H2, I figure that's what it's talking about?
Yes,
but
that's right, yeah.
Awesome.
Yes, so what we've made some assumptions around, where was that slide? Anyway, I can speak to, oh yeah, it's here. So we made, as part of the Evergreen IRP, we were able to incorporate sort of emerging resources, which was great. So we included the future ability to burn hydrogen as gas. We also included the ability or potential for SMRs. Again, this is all ownership agnostic, as well as not taking into consideration any existing policy that might prevent some of those emerging technologies. We also looked at geothermal. So hydrogen-fueled CTs was one of the assumptions that we made, and the assumptions that we put into the Evergreen IRP, based on the research that we had done, is that by 2035, the technology would be available, not only available, but commercially available, to enable our existing CTs to be, or combustion turbines, to be modified to burn hydrogen as fuel. And so with any of the new combustion turbines that we're going to be adding to our resource mix, or adding as capacity on the system going forward, one of the key criteria of those combustion turbines is that they have to be enabled to be modified to burn hydrogen in the future. So, and even have the potential to blend hydrogen as we're progressing to 2035. We know now that some companies will say that you can burn up to a certain amount. Like they say now you could probably burn up to 5%. Of course, it requires other modifications that cost money, so you have to evaluate the economics of that. But any sort of opportunity that we have to do that moving towards 2035, if it shows that it's economic and results in the lowest cost option for customers, we'll be making sure that we're able to do that. Yeah.
Very cool, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Will there be a 2030 ratepayers plan to accompany the resource development plan?
Yes. So, absolutely. So there's, I think, trying to get a sense, of course, of what the impact is going to be on ratepayers going forward. So, of course, we're going to have an updated GRA that will be in the way for 2025, I believe, will be the next one. Yeah. So that will investigate what the impacts on, on rates will be for the transition to 2030. The other piece that's really important is that, any available funding to help subsidize the cost of our transition to 2030 is something that's really important to us, and we're actively engaging on how to make that work for us and for our customers.
And I know you mentioned a bit at the beginning, like the visits to your website and stuff like that, but
Yes.
How is this all being communicated, I guess, to the general public, for lack of a better term? Just because, it is very interesting to know what the plan is and how it looks and the timelines and everything like that. So I'm just wondering if there's a social media campaign coming or something along those lines.
Yeah, we were talking about that earlier. Actually,
With
our comms team
comments
is pushing
disabled.
this pretty. They're definitely wanting to get the word out. Actually, you'll see myself and our director, Chris Milligan, who's the director of the system planning team, did a little video talking about the IRP. So you can see that on the Nova Scotia Power website as well, and on our social media feeds. But one of the things that we rely on actually is our IRP website, and so we're trying as much as we can to sort of get that out to folks. So that's the nspower.irp.ca, and so on that website we basically have all of the material that is the sort of the underpinning the Evergreen IRP. So you can look at our scope of work, you can look at the assumptions, all of the draft modeling results, the outcome of the IRP in terms of the updated action plan and roadmap items. You can see that resource plan and what that looks like, and all of the information and the analysis that's behind it. As well, you can also, that's where our annual updates on our action plan and roadmap item will be posted. So that's helpful information to not only see, the fact that we have committed to doing this, but that we're actually progressing these action plans and what the roadmap items are telling us too in terms of how the system planning environment is changing and how that might impact our action plan. The other piece that's important too is that we have all of our records for the 2020 IRP, so everything that we did to precede that. So it's all available to the public. But I think the other important piece is that we want to hear from people. So if there are questions related to the IRP, related to how we're moving forward, we have an email address. It's irp@nspower.ca. So any questions related to the IRP, we really would welcome it, and happy to hear what folks are thinking and if there are any questions on how we're progressing. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yes. Yeah, and if you email that inbox, we'll put you on the list.
Any more questions? I have one. You mentioned we know that EVs, right? They're going to
Yes.
grow. They're going to make the demand go up. And you also mentioned EV charge bidirectional EV chargers.
Yeah.
So how do you see Nova Scotia Power incentivizing a homeowner or maybe a industrial client to participate in a demand control or demand management program to help the grid to lower the demand when the batteries are charged and they're not expecting to use the forklift for the next 4 hours, 5 hours?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Maybe some background on what's included in our load forecast might be helpful. So, of course, we've been working with E3 to understand sort of what are some jurisdictional trends around EV charging, and so we're using other jurisdictions as a proxy for what is charging behavior look like if you had an EV fleet of vehicles. What would and what would those electrification trends look like if you had managed charging? So what we've incorporated into our load forecast is an assumption right now of 70% managed charging, which includes that bidirectional, and I'll talk about that in a moment, as well as 30% unmanaged charging. So basically, charge whenever you would like, which is going to cause some, impacts to our peak load requirements. And so what's happening in parallel actually is in relation to our Smart Grid Nova Scotia project. So we've got about 100 charging stations that are being analyzed for that bidirectional charging. And what it does is it enables Nova Scotia Power to have some level of control to optimize that charging. So both charging the vehicle and then, of course, allowing the vehicle to charge back to the system exactly when we're in need of it. So that is currently being studied right now as part of the Smart Grid Nova Scotia program, and that the learnings from that are going to inform our forecasting and any potential programs going forward that will help support managed charging. So once we have those results, we'll have a better idea of what that programming is going to look like and the value of it, and how we can get customers involved in that, and how they can participate going forward.
And that file should be closed by December. The
Yeah.
Smart Grid project, all the information should be closed, in 2 months' time, I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
Should be, available to the public.
Yeah, and there'll also be time of use rates as well. So encouraging folks to shift their charging behavior to periods where they're in an off-peak period.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Any other question? I'll monopolize the microphone here, so another question. I was looking at, you mentioned that you have, you looked at 24 different scenarios, right? I guess different mix, more solar, less solar, more wind, more batteries, I guess.
Yeah.
Hydrogen, should be a mix of different energy sources.
Yeah.
I was wondering if offshore wind is in one of the scenarios, and tidal from the Bay of Fundy, if
Yeah.
any of those are in the scenarios.
So what we do is, as part of our modeling, so we use Plexus as our modeling software. So it's a capacity expansion model coupled with an economic dispatch model. And what we do is we make available, so we embed certain resources that we know are either pre-existing on the system, but we also embed projects that we know are going to happen. So for example, like the rate-based procurement wind projects, we know those are going to go ahead, so we've embedded those into our modeling assumptions. For the rest of the resources and the forward-looking forecast, we make resources available, and we implement the metrics of how those resources would operate, as well as the most up-to-date cost metrics that we have from both a capital and a variable cost as well. And so the model then optimizes not only how it's dispatching, but first the resources that it selects to enable to meet our firm capacity on the system, and then our energy resources going forward to meet our load demand. And so offshore wind was enabled in the model as a supply side resource. Given the information that we have right now around the capacity factor of that wind, meaning how much it can generate in comparison to the installed capacity, versus the cost, our models didn't select offshore wind as a resource option. However, if the current projects that are being talked about in the news right now do go ahead, and there's tons of support from the province, or we see sort of a change in those capacity factors, there's a lot of really great study work going on at Dalhousie with Lucas Swan, who's looking at a change in the capacity factor, or a renewed understanding of what the capacity factors will be for offshore wind in our region. We can see that as part of our Evergreen IRP process as a significant change potentially, and go back and do a reassessment to understand if the world would look a little different with that updated information. Yeah.
Okay, good, thank you. And a third, no, two is enough. No, thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. Is again, I'm sure that most of us wanted to see how the projections are, how we're going to get to it. I'm glad to know that we looked at 24 different scenarios from different angles. So that's great to know. And again, thanks for the presentation. Excellent.
Thank you.